My soul magnifies the Lord. So we've heard Mary's story in this section of Luke. It began with a visitation from God telling her that pregnancy she was worried about, it's okay. What happens with that baby is going to be more than she imagined. And then we learned about her visit with Elizabeth, about being still a little unsure about her pregnancy, but seeking comfort, seeking to know she's not alone with her cousin Elizabeth. And Elizabeth singing forth a song that says she is blessed. And during that time with Elizabeth, during that time when both of them gained comfort, an older woman who's not sure what will happen with her pregnancy, who's been alone trying to safeguard it and keep it safe, and the young woman who's heard all the rumors, who's heard all the stories about her, who's heard what people have said about being pregnant and unmarried. Together, they start sharing the stories that they know of the women in their history, the songs that they've learned to sing. They remember the songs that Miriam sang when they reached the other side of the Red Sea, escaping slavery and proclaiming the wonder of God, the victory of being free at last. They remember the song sung by Deborah the judge, who sings out the victory and wonder of God who has freed us from the dangers we have faced, although dangers they also caused. But they sing out in wonder and blessing of a woman who helped to free them in a society where women didn't do that. They sing the song of Hannah, who so wanted a baby as the husband's other wife, we won't get into that detail, who had multiple babies, goes every year to the temple begging God for her own child, a sign of her own worth. And when she finds out, and the priest tells her that that baby is coming, she promises that baby to God, and she sings a song of hope and promise of the mercy of God. They tell those stories. And they even tell the hard stories. The stories of women who've been hurt by men, whether enemy men or king's sons. The stories that share that same word that Mary sings in her song. And so Mary, hearing all of that, the history of the women that have surrounded her, sings out to God finally for the miracle of this baby. She sings out to God in wonder and praise. She sings out about what God has done, not just for her, but for her people. Now remember, Mary is from that part of the surrounding countryside that wasn't considered ideal, because they practiced their faith a little bit differently from the people who were in the good part, the good Jews. She was from that part that had a different understanding about how you lived faith. And yet, she sings about a God who will gather all of her people together. A God who she is grateful for because he has lifted up the lowly. Now, when we hear that word lowly, we think poor, meaning she came from a lower class background, right? Or we think Mary, meek, mild, and calm, right? That she was passive and all this happened to her and she was just the ideal person. But that word, lowly, is only used 2 other times. Times where there was sexual violence perpetrated against women in the Old Testament. Which makes you wonder whether Luke had that in mind because he wanted to acknowledge that this pregnancy, even with all the stories of glory surrounding it, there were questions. But Mary takes that knowledge, however you interpret that word, whether being poor, whether being mild and meek, or whether being the victim of unkindness. She takes that position and thanks God, the merciful God, who has lifted up those who are lowly, who has lifted up those who are hungry and fed them. And this is the part I love. This is my favorite song, right? Who lifts up those who have been left out and hurt and abused by a system that cares more for the rich and wealthy than for the poor, for the normal. She hears those words, sings them out, and says, the rich will be dragged down from the thrones and sent away empty. She speaks about a God whose understanding of how the world works isn't about drastic inequality between rich and poor. It's about a world where everyone has enough to be fed. And so she sings out this song to God, the God who makes it possible. Mary, drawing on that previous history of women, sings a song that inspires us through the ages and sings a song that transforms that little baby's life. Can you imagine growing up in a house where your mom sang that lullaby to you? Where your mom told you that God cares so much for those who have been left out and wants to bring the empire down, wants to bring the rich, the powerful down, and wants to provide you with food. And can you imagine that baby growing up with that song and those stories of the women in the Bible who have changed lives, had their lives changed in horrible ways, but came out and did something more. And that baby hears that story. And so when that baby grows up and decides to follow God in the way that he heard the Spirit speak to him in a river, his very first sermon proclaims what Mary has said using the scriptural text. He says that the lame shall dance, the mute shall sing, the oppressed will be freed, the prisoners will be let go. He says, this time is now. And then promptly gets kicked out of town because that's not what anybody wanted to hear. But she taught him to look out in the world and do the good that was in front of him. to do the good that appeared before him, whether it was a person who felt left out and left behind, a person who was hurt and in need of healing, a person who was not the desired class, race, gender, who was welcomed into the community he was creating. Those words that Mary sang impacted that child who became an adult, and taught us what it meant to be saved, to be free, to work to bring and build the kingdom of God here on earth. So I want to share, we've been sharing quilting stories the last few weeks. So this week I want to share with you these kind of quilts and the story of this people. So these quilts are made by this very tiny town in Alabama where there are only 350 people. And this tiny town in Alabama has had quite the history. So this piece of land, which had been worked for generations by enslaved people, had been bought up by an enslaver from North Carolina when the farmers fell on hard times. And that North Carolina farmer took his wife and family in the wagons with all their stuff down to this piece of land in Alabama, 700 miles away from where he started, but forced his enslaved people, those women and children and men, to walk that whole distance to Alabama to work that land. Eventually, during that time, he lost the land, or his generations lost the land. And it was a time of deep distress in the United States during the 1920s. And when FDR came to be president, his government bought up that piece of land in this town and gave it to the formerly enslaved families for low interest, low cost. And so those people who had never had land but had worked that land now owned that land. And the women of that land made quilts. Not the pretty ones like here where everything is perfect and just in line and all the colors match and it turned out just right. But they took the fabric that they had, the work clothes that had been torn apart, so that one's made out of blue jeans, right? Where you can see some of the stains and patterns, the broken bits. And the pieces weren't perfectly square or perfectly even, but they sewed them together, remembering the family in each piece of cloth. They took those bits of fabric, making quilts year after year. That family, if you notice and you start reading, the names will be that enslaver's name. They took those faded and worn pieces of fabric and stitched them together. And for the most part, this little tiny town was often ignored. The road that led the way to there, because it's surrounded on three sides by water, was not paved until way later than everybody else's roads were paved. Everything that you could not get happened to that town. It was isolated and set apart. But someone came through and discovered these amazing quilts. and told the story about it to New York art dealers, right? And so one of those art dealers came and bought up as many quilts as he could, going door to door, so that they could be displayed somewhere else, that he could have the wealth of the quilts. And yet it's not the end of the story. That they fought back against the ownership of the quilts. And they just kept making them year after year, generation after generation, until at one point, the New York Times says of those quilts, some of the most miraculous works of modern art that have been produced. They did the good that was in front of them. They took those scraps of cloth and turned them into something that provided warmth and comfort, that was like a hug when their family laid under it at night or laid under it as they watched television. Those quilts took on a second life. And those women, their granddaughters and great-granddaughters, started to change how those quilts were seen and used and experienced. Fighting back against people who wanted to buy up their art, to create a living history for that art, with plans for that art to be consumed and experienced by everyone. I don't know if it's still the case because the article I read was from a while ago. But they became so famous as quilters that their work appeared in Target and other stores. And they now have an Etsy shop where they can sell their quilts right directly to people. And their hope is to take those quilts and create a living history museum and community center that passes on the tradition, that teaches others about the history, that teaches others how to take that love and material and make something new and old at the same time. So this week would normally be our table talk discussions. And so that means that I've got questions for you. So, Jim, can you go get cards and hand them out to everybody who's behind you now? All right, did everyone get one? All right, so what I want us to think about is the good that we can do. And so the way we get to finding out the good that we can do, David Lamont talks about how we like to think of heroes as the way that the world changes. And so we would tell the story of the hero. So for example, we tell the story of Mary, right? And she miraculously healed the world through the birth of a baby. But Lamont says that that's not how the world changes. The world actually changes because of the community that surrounds people. And the community getting involved in changing the world. And so those women who created those quilts began to change the world because they shared an art form that didn't have to be perfect, but could create beauty. So I want you to answer each of these questions. So they're in categories. So start out with the first question, because some of us, in order to figure out what good we can do, have to start with what annoys or bugs us or frustrates us or gets us angry. So what in the world right now is doing that for you? And then answer the second question, which is, What inspires you? What do you see happening in the world that makes you sit up a bit straighter and feel a little more hopeful about humanity? So I'll give you about 5 minutes to answer the 3 questions, or 3 categories of questions. So I'm going to invite you now to find someone who you don't normally talk to share some of your thoughts about these questions. So for those of you who are from one of the root congregations, find a person not from your root congregation to speak with.
Thank you.
So I want to conclude this section with a poem that's in the devotional that I handed out that is by Sarah Speed, that is written for this week. It's called Harvest. Maybe none of it matters. Maybe you can't make a difference. Or maybe that watermelon seed you spit out over the summer will grow into a green orb full of sticky sweet fruit. Maybe the rain will nourish it. Maybe your mother's hands will pull it from the vine, slice it into wedges, and place it on the dining room table. Maybe the neighbors will come over and chop into that soft pink fruit, juice water running down their chins. Maybe you will laugh at the shared experience at this garden-grown communion, and maybe the stars will shine brighter that night. People say that the problems of the world are too big to make a difference, but surely those people have forgotten the fruit that grows from one little seed.